So good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about fertility. And in the last class, we were talking about the trends in the adolescent fertility here in the US. And overall, the fertility rates for women between 15 and 19 years of age has been declining over time since the 1940s. And this is actually probably due to the increase in the use of contraceptives, right? And as we saw in the framework proposed or kind of conceptualized by Baumgartz after using the previous framework that was proposed by Davis and Blake, contraception use is a major factor that influence the decline in fertility rates. And among those teenagers that have kids, most of them in more recent years are unmarried. So among those teenagers back in 1940 who had kids, 14% of them were unmarried. And now 89% of them are unmarried. So you have two things going on there. First, teenage women are having less kids overall between the ages of 15 and 19. And among those who still have kids in such young ages, they tend to don't be married. They are this 89% here. So it's showing us that first, back in 1940, women tended to marry much earlier because only 14% of those that were having kids at that time, while they were teenagers, they were unmarried. And among the rest of them, the fewer that remain having kids in more recent years, most of them are already still unmarried but having kids. And whenever we talk about teenage fertility, it's good to break into these two different subgroups. The younger teenagers, so women between 15 and 17 years of age, and the older teenagers, those between 18 and 19 years of age. And what you see is that for younger women, those between 15 and 17, the fertility rate for them is 12.3 per 1,000. So that means for every 1,000 women in the US between 15 and 17 years of age, back in 2013, they experienced on average 12.3 births. And for those that are a little older, 18 to 19, as you would expect, the fertility is higher, 47.3. So it makes a lot of sense to break down this teenage group in two portions, because the reality of 15 to 17 is really different from those between 18 and 19. And another thing that we see in the US a lot about all these demographic components, fertility, mortality, and migration, they are really significant differentials on these components by race ethnicity. Specifically about teenage fertility, among Asian Pacific Islanders, the fertility of teenagers, the fertility rate for teenagers is only 7.7 per 1,000. So for every 1,000 teenagers who self-classify as being Asian and Pacific Islander, for every 1,000 of them, 7.7 births. And for Hispanics, that rate is higher, 38 per 1,000. But I put in the website one article, just a news article, I think was from the New York Times, that shows that in more recent years, the Hispanic women are also changing their fertility behavior. So they also tend to postpone fertility to older ages. That means declines in teenage pregnancy or teenage fertility. And they tend to have fewer children overall. And this is usually true for second generation and third generation Hispanics. Second generation are those that have parents that were born in a Latin American country, but they were born here in the US. And third generation are those that both, their parents and grandparents were born in the US. So the second generation, those that are born in the US and their parents are born outside, they already assimilate to the American culture, to the overall American culture, having fewer children. So the rates among teenage Hispanic women has been declining. And when you get into the third generation, those that are born in the US, parents born in the US, and grandparents as well, then you start to have much lower levels of fertility, more in the same levels as we see for the overall population, right? But the first generation Hispanics, those that are born outside and live here, they tend to have higher fertility, right? So the declines in Hispanic fertility has been experienced more for second and third generations. Yeah. So here's just an example of how the teenage fertility rates, they vary by age group. And the differentials for the young teenagers and the old teenagers is really clear since the 1960s until 2013, based on data that's shown in the textbook. And overall, it kind of like remained, had some increases and did decline, but kind of like went up again in the early, in the 90s. But after that, in the mid 90s, you start to see a decline in fertility for both groups. And as I showed with that only single point for 2013, the teenage fertility rates for those between 18 and 19 is higher. And this differential has been observed for several years, okay? The birth rates, that last topic in the previous slide that I mentioned, that the teenage fertility rates, they vary by race, ethnicity. This is data for teenage birth rates for women between 15 and 19, so not breaking down by age. For 1991, 2007, 2013, and 2014. And overall, we see a decline between 1991 and 2014. And you also see a decline for all these other race ethnicity groups. For Hispanics, for non-Hispanic Black, American Indians and or Alaska Natives, non-Hispanic White, and Asian or Pacific Islanders. So you see these declines over time for all groups, but this graph also shows us, if you look in each time point, that the Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black teenagers, they usually have higher fertility rates than, for example, the non-Hispanic White and the Asian or Pacific Islander. And that's true even for more recent years. 2014, these rates here are higher than for Native Americans and higher than comparing to non-Hispanic White, okay? So here we're pretty much saying that overall teenage fertility rates have been declining over time, but we see really a lot of variation by race ethnicity. But you also see here, for example, the Hispanic population has really high, and the non-Hispanic Black, really high teenage fertility rates compared to non-Hispanic White back in 1991. And now in 2014, still you see the differential, but the overall differential is not so big as it was in previous years, in previous decades. Okay, that's what I was talking about, the first generation, the second generation, the third generation Hispanics. Go on. And I'm just trying to see, like, first generation, there's something so basic that all my research is about. First generation, born outside the US and live in the US. Second generation, born in the US, parents born outside. Third generation, born in the US, parents born in the US, grandparents outside. So just a correction there. The third generation, those are women and parents born in the US, parents born outside. But for the third generation, we usually call them third plus generation, that we aggregate into them those that have at least the parents born here and get everybody, those that have grandparents or born in the US or outside, we usually call them third plus generation immigrants. But what we see usually among Hispanics, if we break them down by first, second, and third plus generation, the first generation still has higher fertility compared to the second generation Hispanics compared to the third plus generation Hispanics, right? I was just trying to correct myself. In the third plus generation immigrants, that's where we get everybody. Parents and themselves born in the US, and doesn't matter if the grandparents are here or not. Another topic in fertility that's important to highlight is the non-marital fertility. Non-marital fertility is related to women having children when they're not married or when they're widowed or divorced. And they used to be called illegitimate fertility. And for cultural reasons, that was not accepted that women would have children when they were not formally married or when they were widowed or divorced. But nowadays, with changes in our culture, more acceptance for fertility outside of marriage, that term is not used anymore. The marital status of the mother, whether she's married, not married, widowed, divorced, why do we care about that? Why do I care if a woman is married or not when they have babies? It's because it's a kind of like a marker. It's an information that we have about the socioeconomic status of women, or more specifically, it's an information that we have about financial, social, and economic resources that women have. When they are married, or at least when they live with their partners in the same household, they have more resources as the couple to invest on the children. Of course, divorced women could also have child support from the partners, but usually women who live with their partners in the household, they have more resources to provide to their children. So that's why we usually care, or we usually measure fertility we try to understand among those women who are not formally married, what's the percentage of them that have children. And in 2013, 41% of non-marital births. In 2013, we observed 41% of non-marital births out of the total number of all births. So that's an increase from what we saw in previous years, in previous decades. In 1940s, only 4% of all births were to women who were not formally married, who were not married or widowed or divorced. In more recent years, we see a gradual increase on the percentage of children that are born to women who are not formally married, increasing from 4% back in the 1940s to 41% in 2013. So pretty much saying that's now much more acceptable for a woman to getting married, to having children when they are not formally married. And just one thing here, when we are talking about non-marital birth, just at the bottom here, non-marital births include births to women in cohabiting unions and unmarried women not cohabiting. So when we are saying that it's increasing from 4 to 41%, it doesn't mean that those women don't have the partner living with them at home. It means that they are not formally married, or they are widowed, or they are divorced. But they could be divorced and have a second partner, and they are not formally married. Or they have a child with with same guy who is living with them, but they are not formally married. So no marital births do include women in cohabiting unions and unmarried women not cohabiting. So that means that this 41%, we might have women with really different life conditions, life resources, because those that are in cohabiting unions have the support in the household of the partner. And those that are not cohabiting and, of course, are not married, they might have the support of the former partner who is now living outside, but that support is much less close and tight into their daily lives than this woman here experienced. In other words, we see, for example, that African American women have really high levels of non-marital fertility. 71% of all Black births are to women in non-marital relations, but the 71%, it doesn't mean that they don't have a partner at home, because some of them, they might have a partner at home, but they are not formally married, okay? And those rates are much lower among Asians. 17% of all Asian births are non-marital fertility for women who are not married, widowed, or divorced, okay? So it's just good to understand that this 71%, it doesn't mean that all these African-American babies are being born in households without the presence of the father. The father might be there, just they are not in a formal marriage situation. They're just cohabiting with the mother, okay? So that's an important thing that's highlighted always when you talk about non-marital fertility. And overall, the number of births, the light blue line here, has been increasing over time, little declines around 2010. And the information here is in the horizontal, in the vertical axis on the right, births in thousands. Overall, the number of births increased because we have still a big population, and it's still a big population of women in reproductive ages between 15 and 49 years of age. But the birth rates, you see, they have also increased between 1970s and 1990s, but in more recent years, you see more stability. A little increase there around 2007, 2008, but then declines afterwards. And the percent unmarried women who have births have also increased a lot. So the birth rate, which takes into account the birth rate of the number of children born overall divided by women between the ages of 15 and 44, has been increasing over time. But we also see what has been increasing over time is the percent of unmarried women between the ages of 15 and 44 who have kids, right? So we have here the percent unmarried and births per 1,000 unmarried women age 15 and 44. Oh, sorry. If I say something wrong, you can correct me, right? What did I say wrong here? The birth rate and the number of births and the percent unmarried, it's all related to unmarried women. This graph here is only related to unmarried women. Percent unmarried per 1,000 unmarried women age 15 to 44, the green line. Percent of births per 1,000 married women aged 15 to 24, and births in thousands also to unmarried women. So this graph here is not showing the number of births for the whole population of women in the US. This is showing the number of births to unmarried women in the US. So what we see is that among unmarried women in the US, the absolute number of births in thousands has been increasing. Even if you get the birth rate, the number of unmarried women in the denominator and in the numerator, how many of them had births, we also see that the birth rate increases, but not so steep in later years, because then we are taking into account the denominator. And the overall percent of unmarried women has also been increasing over time, okay? So we have here the percentage of births to unmarried women has been increasing over time, and the birth rate of them as well. So this is just to show that overall, women who are not in a formally married situation, they could be cohabiting, they could not be cohabiting, but for these different groups of women, it's more common for them to have kids, to get pregnant and have kids born alive, okay, than it was previously. Because in previous decades, what would happen is that women would just marry earlier. They would marry early, and whenever they had kids, they were already in a married situation. Right? Nowadays, it's more acceptable in our society for women not having children for voluntary reasons. And of course, there are also involuntary reasons of why women might not have kids, because of not being able to have kids for infecundity problems, infertility problems. But the voluntary childlessness was almost non-existent between 1950s and 1960s. So women were expected to have children. But then the percentage of women who then don't have child throughout their lives has been increasing since the 1970s, mainly due to voluntary reasons, because now women start to invest more in their career, invest in their education. It's expensive to have children. There is no maternity leave. There is no support from the government. So they tend to have fewer children, and some of them decided to don't have any child at all. Attitudes and norms towards childlessness are becoming more positive overall with changes in gender norms. So overall, women now, if they don't have children, they are not blamed, or they are not denigrated by their families, friends, and peers. It's more acceptable now for women to decide to don't have children overall. Here in this graph is the percentage of women who don't have children between the ages of 30 to 44. Data from 1976 to 2012. What do we see? That for younger women in this overall age group, for younger women, those between 30 to 34, the percentage of those that don't have a child have been increasing over time, and it's continued to increase, but not so steep as it was back in the 70s and 80s, but it's still increasing. And for women a little older in this age group, 35 to 39 and 40 to 44, also the percentage of them who don't have children increased over time, and now it's a little bit more stable, and also with like some little declines in more recent years. Why do you think here in this graph we see higher rates of women not having children at all in younger ages within this age group? 30 to 34, this percentage rates of childlessness are higher compared to 35, 39, and 40 to 44. This woman might just be postponing having children, right? I mean, this graph here is just period data that we collect data in every year by age group and ask if the woman had a child or not. And we are not following women over time, but probably if you follow the group of this woman here from 30 to 34 in the next 5, 10 years until they reach 40 to 44, maybe what they're doing is they're deciding to have children at older ages, right? Around 35 or between 35 and 39. And then they get out of the group of women who don't have children, go into the group of women who have children. So this percentage drops, right? So this differential between 30 to 34 to 35, 49 might be related to postponement in fertility. It's about the tempo effect in fertility that we discussed in the last class. Women postponing the age in which they have children. But when you look at the older woman from 40 to 44, if they don't have children at these ages, of course they can have children later on, 45 to 49. But usually the chances of having children after 44 years of age declines a lot. So what we would expect is that a lot of those that don't have children by the age of 44 will not have children later in their lives. Of course, there are exceptions. But the point here is that this effect in the later group is more related to declines in fertility that will not bounce back afterwards because those women won't have time afterwards to have children at later ages. So the postponement in fertility we observed in younger ages to a little older ages, but in the last age groups in the reproductive in the reproductive age group between 15 to 49, this group here don't have as much time to postpone having children as much. But it's just interesting to see how one single graph here already gives us information about the tempo and period effect on fertility. The tempo about postponement related to this younger woman, and the period related to women overall having less children, taking into account those in older groups within this age group. And the final topic in this chapter about fertility is related to male fertility. Male fertility is rarely examined in fertility studies. Whenever we ask questions about how many children people had, if they had a child in the last year, how many children people had, it gives us an idea of the overall number of children born alive. That's a parity, right? Parturition, overall number. Information about whether people had a child in the last year can give us fertility in this last year, more recent fertility. And with that information, we can see more variation over time. But those two basic questions, there are other questions in fertility, children born alive, children born dead, or number of pregnancies, because some of the pregnancies might not result in a live birth. There are several different questions, but overall, those questions about fertility and birth history and pregnancy history, they are asked to women. Usually they are asked more to women. And there are several reasons of why these questions are not asked to men. You have biological reasons. Men have a wider range of childbearing years between 15 and 79, comparing to 15 and 49 that we take the standard for women. And theoretically, there is no limitation of children that males can have, right? So that can be a lot of children with different partners, and because their body is not affected by having children. So for women, there is a limitation, biologically speaking. Methodological, there's less data available for males than females. this is not just because of a survey question being asked only to women. It's not only because of that. Because I mentioned birth history, pregnancy history, those questions are usually asked more only to women. But not only that, even some registration data. Remember registration data that we talked before in the sources of demographic data? When we are talking about birth certificates, in a lot of countries, the information about the father is missing in birth certificates. So we don't have data about from the registration system on male fertility. We have it about female fertility because we have mother's age, some places collect mother's education, and how many children they had throughout their lives based on the registration system. That information of father's age, father's education is missing in a lot of birth certificates, mostly in developing countries. But also, there is a sociological reason of why usually we don't analyze male fertility. Because in previous decades, males were often regarded as breadwinners who would work outside the household and had little involvement in fertility, in raising their kids. The only work was pretty much impregnating women and not helping with the whole aspect of raising kids. And because of that, a lot of surveys don't ask information about children to fathers, exactly because a lot of these fathers don't even know information about the children, don't know information about date of birth, don't know the history of pregnancy of their partners. So that's why this pregnancy history is clearly asked to women, but fertility history, number of children, could be asked to the fathers. But because of them, we will not provide useful information because of not caring, having memory issues, because of not being involved, the quality of data would be really bad, right? So all these different reasons make data availability in terms of number of children per man and per age group of fathers being really rare. But of course, male fertility has been increasing in importance. And I will just talk a little bit more about these 3 points. There is a greater variance within males in terms of fertility, those that don't have children overall and those that have a bunch. And that creates some research questions to try to understand why some men have a lot of kids and some don't. And the fact that some men are married, it's a really close determinant on the chances that the man will have children. And there are also different patterns of male fertility compared to female fertility that would be important to understand. And because now in our society, fathers are more involved raising kids and taking care of household activities, not just related to taking care of the household, but taking care of the kids, these questions here start to be more important to us in recent years, right? In terms of greater variance within males, the greater variance contributed by the male sex, there is a greater variance contributed by the male sex than the female sex to the next generation. I mean, we just saw in the previous graph that the percentage of women who don't have children overall has been increasing over time. But still, overall, most women, they have at least one child. Of course, the number of women not having any children overall has been increasing, but it's still really high percentage of women have children. Among males, there is a higher percentage of those that don't have children at all. And there is also a considerable percentage of them that have a lot of kids. I mean, I mean, some examples, you can think about examples in your own life, right? My grandmothers, like one had 8 children, the other one had 2 children. One grandfather, he had 6 children, and the other one had 14 children with 5 different wives. So this variation you see in recent generations, our grandparents, great-grandparents, right? So of course, we also see women having a lot of children, more than 10, but that is much more common among males because of having multiple partners as well, right? Cool. Marriage is really an important factor to explain the chances of men having children. Male fertility is likely to be influenced by marital status and employment status. This case here is really important, employment status. I showed you at the beginning of this lecture in the previous slides, oscillations in total fertility rate over time. That total fertility rate is based on data from women, not from men. But what did we see in that graph? We saw that in moments of economic crisis, fertility declined, right? So if you go back there to this one of the first graphs that I showed in this lecture, you see here that in moments of economic recession, like the Great Depression in the 1930s, fertility declines a lot. And this is related to women. When you have more economic development, it increases. And exactly the baby boom cohort here after the World War II. The 1970s energy crisis, fertility declines again. The Great Recession in 2008 declines again. The pandemic declines again, right? So always when we have these moments in history in which economy is affected that make people lose their jobs, fertility declines, right? So the number overall of babies has been declining exactly because of the effects of the current pandemic on jobs, on the economy. And that's already observed for women, but it's really observed for men as well. So whenever you have increase in unemployment rates, you see a decline in male fertility. And when men tend to get unemployed, chances of them getting married is also lower. So getting unemployed is the age in which they decide to marry, and also will postpone the age in which they will finally have children. So all these topics are related, right? But this marital status, employment status, it's really strong among men. And we already saw that's also important among women. And married and employed men usually have higher number of children ever born. When they get married, they have a more stable situation usually. They have a more stable job usually. And then they tend to have children with higher chances, okay? And then the third topic, there are different patterns of male fertility. As we saw before, the age-specific fertility beginning a little later among men. So women tend to have children at younger ages than men, and men tend to start a little later. Age-specific fertility is stopping much later among men than among women. And this is related to the previous slide that I showed here, right? Here it said, oh, but biologically speaking, men can have children between 15 and 79, and actually there is no limit on 79. But actually the empirical data from population shows that usually the chances of they having children at younger ages like that is much smaller than among women. They have children at older ages. And the age in which they stop having children is much later in their lifetime compared to women. The male total fertility rates are higher than female total fertility rates, especially in countries with male and female total fertility rates higher than 2.2. So in countries that still have fertility above the replacement level, above 2.1, usually in those countries, you see a higher male fertility than female fertility. And that's an interesting topic for research. And that's, for example, that's related to the example that I gave of the grandfather having 14 kids with 5 different wives, right? And it's really related to a lot of like cultures that we still see in Africa of people men having multiple partners, multiple families. And then men have more kids on average than women having kids on average, right? And so the cohabitation pattern by sex also varies. There is a higher tendency of women to cohabit than men. I mean, it's not just a moral discussion. I'm not here to discuss religion, to discuss moral. I'm here to discuss demography, to discuss science. I'm not saying that we should get married. I'm not saying that we should have kids only we get married. Of course, I'm not saying that. I'm analyzing data from populations to understand what's the situation of those women and men who have children before they get married, when they have children when they're cohabiting, not formally married, and if they have children and they never get married or cohabit, right? Overall, there is a higher chance of women to live in cohabiting situations than men. Why is that? Why do you think is that? It's still related to a society that there is a lot of gender inequality or discrepancies. So men, they decide to have a partner when they are more stable in life, when they have a secure job, and then they go and live with a partner and have children. With women, because we still have lower chances for women to get higher education, to get good jobs, a lot of them enter into a relationship with a partner living at home even before getting formally married, still in cohabitation. So this difference is more evident among women who previously lived alone, those who left the households of their parents, and then they tend to have, and they were not married at that time, and then they tend to experience cohabitation throughout their life compared to women who left their household of their parents already married. And that's obviously more common right now, of women getting out of their parents' house to go to college in another city and living with roommates, and that increases the chance of them cohabiting with their partners before they are married, right? Is that a bad thing? Of course not. That's not the point. There's just a pattern that we see in our society, right? But if that cohabitation results in a pregnancy and having children, and the partner moves away, then it might create an issue for less resources for the child. Usually women who are foreign born, exactly because of having less opportunities in the country, having not so wide social networks, narrow social networks, they tend to be more exposed to the chance of cohabiting than to formally getting married. And women who already lived in fragmented families that experienced divorce or widowed family, or families that had some deaths in the family or something, that they didn't have both parents, they also have more chances to experience cohabitation throughout their lives than men. So all of this here are subgroups of women who have more chances of experiencing cohabitation compared to men. Even men in those situations have lower chances of cohabiting than women in these subgroups, okay? Different marriage and fertility pattern by sex are also observed. There's stronger negative effects of educational attainment on fertility among women compared to men. So women with higher education attainment, those with a college degree or even higher degree, they tend to have lower fertility. Higher education, negative effect on fertility, lower fertility. And that negative effect of educational attainment on fertility is stronger among women than among men. Unemployment is related to men's postponement of marriage, which is something that I just mentioned before. Men, when they experience unemployment, they postpone the age in which they will get married, and then also that, of course, influences fertility. And there is a stronger religion effect among women than men. If women follow a specific religion that emphasizes marriage, that emphasizes a specific number of children, those beliefs are stronger among women who follow the same religion compared to men. In other words, men break the rules more often than women, right? Even among religious people. Overall, the study about male fertility, it's really scarce. We don't have so much information because of lack of data, all that, and also because of lack of interest before. But now, because men are being part of like raising children and being part of fertility, and we saw now fertility among men has also some variations in terms of unemployment and everything, cohabitation. We need to incorporate research on male fertility to better understand these variations by gender in demography. And we have to understand fertility and parenting trends involving both men and women. Okay? So that's the chapter about fertility. And now I will start on the chapter about mortality. In the chapter about fertility before, I had some extra readings. The extra reading here was exactly the one showing that fertility among Hispanic women has been declining and getting closer to non-Hispanic white women. Example of fertility rates are those two Excel files, one for Brazil to estimated for several years age-specific fertility rates and total fertility rates, and the US for 1 year only, I estimated all those rates, age-specific fertility rates, total fertility rates, gross reproduction rate, net reproduction rate, and mean age of childbearing. For mortality, I have listed here some more information. The chapter, the lecture is already available. There is this New York Times article about child mortality. If you just click there, it takes you to this page here, and it shows overall that in the world, there are fewer children dying. So fewer kids below the age of 5 dying in all different portions of the world. And the New York Times is always good on organizing research results in a really interactive way. And here's showing this variation over time from 2000 to 2017. So this is an article that's available online for everybody. This is the overall reduction in child mortality to show that, of course, fertility started higher in African countries in specific time point. So the reduction between 2005 and 17 is stronger in those areas that had high fertility at the beginning of the period being measured, right? And then focus on specific countries as well. India, Nigeria, Thailand, and so on. The other link, US life expectancy decreased after 2014. Oh, yeah. We talked about a decrease in life expectancy after the pandemic, but what is this decline in life expectancy since the 2014? What is it about? So about this drug crisis, opioid crisis that we have been seeing in the US. So if you just click here, it's going to take you to this article, kind of showing that has been an increase in mortality and then a decline life expectancy because of drug overdose, suicides, and organ system diseases. So this decline in life expectancy, in other words, increase in mortality, has been observed since 2014. But as that graph that I showed to you guys in previous lectures shows that decline in fertility is even stronger now during the pandemic, right? I showed it to you on which lecture was that? I think probably was on the lecture about theories of demography. I can go back there and then go back to that same graph that shows life expectancy. But just to say that now during the pandemic, we observe increases in mortality and then declines in life expectancy, but we also have seen some other issues going on in the country. I, of course, would not make advertisements about billionaires. That's not my goal in life. But this documentary here by Netflix about Bill Gates, I just think that it's interesting because he, in the part one of this documentary, he's using money from his foundation to try to develop some new technology that will provide better sanitation to developing countries. Instead of to create sewer system that you have to dig down holes across the roads and then put all those pipes and everything, he's trying to make people come up with solutions to improve sanitation and treat sanitation in a faster way instead of having to create all that infrastructure, like cheaper ways to deal with it. And this, I'm just citing this specific documentary, not because I like the guy, it's just because of there are different ways in which we can try to improve infrastructure, public infrastructure to the population, instead of just thinking about these traditional ways of providing treated water and putting down sewer systems in different societies, still developing societies that don't have those. I will also talk about some techniques in mortality that help us compare mortality levels across different countries. Because if we simply compare crude death rate from developed countries and crude death rates for developing countries, that could be misleading. Because developed countries have a higher percent of the population who is older, and their chances of dying is higher. Developing countries still have high fertility, so you have a higher percentage of their population in younger ages. The chance of them of dying is lower. And sometimes when we compare simply crude death rate, number of people dying divided by the overall number of the population, developing countries could have lower crude death rates compared to developed countries. This subset of the lecture, I will discuss these techniques called standardization and life tables that try to take into account mortality rates for specific age groups, taking into account the size of the population in each one of these age groups, right? So this link here has a compressed file. And if you uncompress it, we will open an Excel file. That's the standardization here. And this file will just pretty much get the population in the US in a specific year, 2006, by age group, the number of deaths of that population by age group. If we simply get the number of people who die in the US in 2006, which was around 2.5 million people, divided by 298 million, and multiply by 1,000, how much do we get? The crude death rate, 8.41. If we go in Venezuela and we get the number of deaths that were observed in total, divided by the size of the population, multiplied by 1,000, how much do we get? 4.63. So in 2006, for every 1,000 people in the US, we observed 8.4 deaths. In Venezuela, for every 1,000 people that we had, observed 4.6 deaths. Oh, life standards in Venezuela are better than in the US. We have lower mortality there. We cannot compare this to this because the proportion of people in each one of these age groups is really different between the US and Venezuela. You have more younger people, these numbers here are higher in Venezuela than in the US. And if you control for these differences, what you're going to see during this standardization measure that I will go through step by step on how to do it, actually, you should not compare the 8.4 crude death rate that was originally estimated for the US with the 4.6 for Venezuela. You have to compare the 8.4 to 9.6, which is the crude death rate for Venezuela using the same age distribution as in the US. I will go through the methodological details, but just to say that actually mortality in Venezuela is higher than in the US when you take into account age distribution of your population. Okay? The other link is about the life table. How do you estimate that famous measure of life expectancy at birth? How many years on average we would expect people to live if they were exposed to a specific set of age-specific mortality rates? And then that's this other file here. If you uncompress it, you get this one here. So here we have the population, more specific, the population of women in the US in 2017, the number of women by age group. So we have here the number of women by age group and the number of deaths of women experienced in that specific year by age group. With these two columns here, I can calculate how many years on average I would expect this woman to live if they were exposed to these death rates. What are the death rates? Deaths divided by the population in each age group. See, we break it down by age group. So we would expect that if a group of women was exposed to these mortality rates here, based on data from 2017, they would live on average 78 years. And this life table has a lot of formulas behind them. And this is the topic that usually students have issues during the exam. So pay attention to that, study that, okay? And we usually do life tables both for men and for women. So here's the one for women and here's the one for men. Cool? And we're going to discuss this in detail as well. Some extra readings also related to the pandemic. It's all compressed in a zipped file here. And this is software developed by the United Nations for mortality measurement. It's more for advanced studies, but if you can also, that's usually more applied for countries that have not so reliable information on mortality, and you can access it through this website, right? And the lecture itself is this one here. So that was just an introduction to show what are the sub-portions of this lecture on mortality. So give an overview of mortality, and then provide a measurement. Should we correctly measure mortality trends over time to be able to compare different countries, and mostly different populations that have different age distribution, because mortality chances are much higher among older people. So standardization life table, pretty much those two spreadsheets that I showed you. And then give, in the life table portion here, you see a lot of slides, but I broke in two parts. I will present the main part, and the other one is marked there as extra. So I will not cover in detail here, but with the first part, you are able to understand the spreadsheet. Give a short history of mortality in the world. Talk about mortality trends and causes of death that vary by developed and developing countries, vary by age, and so on. Mortality and longevity in the US, and as we talk, mortality in the US has been increasing since 2014 because of the opioid crisis, but also now, as we saw in previous lectures, because of the pandemic, and having effects on the life expectancy at birth. And then focus on infant mortality, because usually countries that overcome issues of really high levels of infant mortality rates, their life expectancy at birth increases a lot. When you decline the number of people before reaching 1 year of age, life expectancy have really considerable increases. And talk about some future course of mortality as discussed in the textbook, and then give some updated data about the pandemic that I got from last Tuesday, the 26th. I already have data here, slides that were from previous semesters, but then I have been updating from the current semester. So I posted there. But I will put it here, add here, that I slide about variation of life expectancy over time in the US until now, based on that data up to 2020, okay? So overall, the impact of mortality varies a lot by social demographic characteristics. So it varies by age. Older people have higher chance of dying. By sex, men have higher chance of dying than women. Race, ethnicity, also African Americans have more chance of dying than, for example, non-Hispanic whites. Social class, poor people have higher chance of dying than richer people. Marital status, non-married people higher chance of dying. And area of residence, people living in rural areas have higher chance of dying than people living in urban areas. Levels of development, medical conditions, and a host of other factors influence life expectancy. So those spreadsheets that we are doing about standardization and life expectancy at birth, we are doing the same way that we thought about fertility, right? We are just estimating the indicator. Then afterwards, we try to understand what are the reasons of why mortality is declining. Why is declining so fast? What's going on in that society? The same idea that we had for fertility with the approximate determinants of fertility, we try to understand what are the factors making women have less children. In mortality, we also try to understand after we correctly estimate the mortality indicators, we try to understand what is making mortality vary over time. There have been major changes of the historical record in causes of death. People used to die mainly of infectious and parasitic diseases. Today, the major causes of death in developed countries are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Major causes of death are different in countries with high and low levels of life expectancy. Countries that still have low levels of life expectancy, a lot of diseases still killing babies before reaching age 1, and a lot of still high rates of infectious and parasitic diseases. In developed countries, those chances are lower. The chances are lower, but still people die because of these issues of infection and parasitic diseases. During the pandemic now, what we see is an increase in deaths caused by infectious diseases. It doesn't mean that developed countries don't experience those. I mean, we have to be really careful with statistics. For example, a major statistic now in the US about the pandemic is that out of all those people right now, current days, dying because of COVID-19, 99% of them are not vaccinated. 99% of the people who are now dying because of COVID-19 are not vaccinated. 1% who are dying because of COVID-19, they are vaccinated, but they are dying, 1%. When you talk about that number, 99%, it was like, wow, yeah, vaccines, cool, great. And then Colin Powell dies. And he was vaccinated, and he dies because of COVID-19. And everybody said, oh, the vaccine doesn't work. Hey, Colin Powell is still part of that 1%. The statistic is still there. But because Colin Powell is such a famous historical person, and was part of the politics of the US for so long, we emphasize that to say, oh, vaccines don't work. Yes, vaccines do work. Still, only 1% of the deaths now are to people who are vaccinated. 99 is still for people who are not vaccinated. So we have to be really careful when we analyze the statistics, the indicators, the overall indicators, and we emphasize too much one particular case. In this example, Colin Powell, right? Looks like, oh no, people now who are vaccinated, I know they were already the 1% of the overall deaths. So this is changing. Developed countries have lower rates of infections and parasitic diseases, people dying for those diseases than in other countries, but it still exists, okay? So we have to be careful with that. By misleading information, both from the media and from politicians, we are better than that. We can understand numbers better than this really clear goal of misinformation. We can overcome misinformation by understanding a little bit of demography. Cool? Measurement of mortality. Going back to John Grant, who I mentioned here before in the first lectures, the father of demography. Quantification of mortality, how many people die, at what ages, what's the trend, and so on. It's something central to demography. And measurement of mortality dates back to John Grant when he publishes his work, Bills of Mortality, using data, parish data from London, from the 1500s, data that he analyzed in the 1600s. And mortality refers to the relative frequency of death in a population. And he was the first person to say, I want to break that by age group and by area of residence. So he was able to analyze mortality trends comparing rural and urban areas, younger and older people, men and women. So he breaks down by specific groups of the population. There are two important concepts in mortality: lifespan and life expectancy. The one that we are more concerned here is life expectancy. But lifespan is pretty much the numerical age limit of human life. What's the maximum recorded age at death that we have recorded in our history? And that's attributable to this French woman, Jeanne-Louise Calment, who died at the age of 122 years and 164 days of age. I recently read on an article questioning her as being the woman reaching that specific age. But overall, whenever you're talking about lifespan, we are thinking, what's the maximum recorded age at death that we have nowadays in our history? Recorded, right? Because some people might live more than that, but they are not counted by the registration system, for example, or by surveys or censuses. Life expectancy, that's what we are more concerned about, is the average expected number of years of life to be lived by a particular population at a given time. And here, the correct way to interpret life expectancy is how we did for total fertility rate. Given a group, a set of age-specific mortality rates. What are age-specific fertility rates? Number of people who died divided by the number of people in that specific age group, 0 to 1, 1 to 4, 5 to 9, until 85 plus, for example. And then we have these age-specific mortality rates by age group. Mortality rates by age group. If we expose a group of people to those mortality rates by age group, as they experience those throughout their whole life, how many years we expect them to live? Life expectancy at birth. And we're going to see more that we can calculate the life expectancy. If someone reaches the age of 50, that person, how many years more that person can be expected to live? Now that person did not die for the previous years. The person reaches 60. What's the chance of people that individual surviving more now that that person did not die before the age of 60? All those life expectancies at specific age groups are calculated in the life table, as we're going to see throughout the semester. We already saw the really simple mortality indicator, the crude death rate. Simply divide the number of deaths in a year in a specific population, divided by the population in the middle of that year, multiplied by 1,000. For the US, for example, there were 2.6 million deaths in 2013, an estimated population of 316 million people, multiplied by 1,000, you have a crude death rate of 8.2. For every 1,000 people in the middle of the year in 2013, around 8.2 died in the year of 2013, between January and December. And the world range in crude death rates vary a lot. United Arab Emirates and Qatar, for example, just 1 death every 1,000 people, and Lesotho, 21, so really high. Is it because the mortality, the conditions in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar are much better than the US? Not necessarily. That's because here you tend to have a younger population than the US, and an older population has higher chance of dying. That's why you have to do standardization or estimate life expectancy at birth. When the crude death rates are compared among countries, differences are sometimes due to differences in age composition. What I just said. The previous example, the US 8.2 and the United Arab Emirates 1, so 8.2 and 1. Previous examples means that there are 8 times more deaths per 1,000 people in the US than in the United Arab Emirates. Why is the crude death rate of the US 8 times higher than the UAE. The main reason is that the UAE is much younger. There are more people in younger ages proportionally than in the US. And younger people have lower chances of dying, right? So that's the main reason. Countries with large proportions of young people have, of course, smaller proportions of older people, and usually have lower crude death rates, as was the case of United Arab Emirates and Qatar. On the other hand, countries with small proportions of young people and larger proportions of older people, like the US, have higher crude death rates, like European countries, Western European countries. Okay? So I will talk about this, how we should not use crude death rate to compare mortality of countries with different age compositions, and then go through and explain that we should use standardization and life expectancy at birth. Okay, so it's 2 p.m. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.